Okay, so Book of Proverbs, mostly written by Solomon, but has some surprises. Going back to 1 Kings 3, verses 6 through 9, and Solomon said, "You have shown great and steadfast love to your servant David, my father, because he walked before you in faithfulness, in righteousness, and in uprightness of heart toward you. And you have kept for him this great and steadfast love, and have given him a son to sit on his throne this day. And now, Yahweh my God, you have made your servant know how to, you have made your servant king in place of David my father, although I am but a little child. I do not know how to go out or come in. And your servant is in the midst of your people, whom you have chosen, a great people, too many to be numbered or counted for multitude. Give your servant, therefore, an understanding mind to govern your people, that I may discern between good and evil, for who is able to govern this, your great people?" Now, God had come to Solomon and asked, what one thing would he ask for? Most kings would have asked for riches, and Solomon asked for the ability to govern the people of Israel wisely, which wouldn't it be great if we had some leaders like that today? I'm sure we do have somewhere, but they're not in charge of much. And the wisdom of Solomon that we have in the scriptures is the outcome of what God gave him. But as we learned from the book of Ecclesiastes and from the history books, Solomon didn't always make wise choices. And in fact, much of the wisdom that God gave him was probably through bad choices. He gave Solomon opportunities to make bad decisions, and he learned from it. And that's where a lot of wisdom comes from. And so Solomon wrote the Proverbs and Ecclesiastes to help the rest of us avoid those mistakes, so that we could learn from listening to wise people instead of making all the mistakes and learning from them ourselves. So this is from the next chapter. "And God gave Solomon wisdom and understanding beyond measure, and breadth of mind like the sand on the seashore, so that Solomon's wisdom surpassed the wisdom of all the people of the East and all the wisdom of Egypt. For he was wiser than all other men, wiser than Etan the Ezrahite, and Heman and Calcol, and Darda, the sons of Mahol, and his fame was in all the surrounding nations. He also spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He spoke of trees, from the cedar that is in Lebanon to the hyssop that grows out of the wall. He spoke also of beasts and of birds and of reptiles and of fish. And people of all nations came to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and from all the kings of the earth who had heard of his wisdom." Now, there aren't 3,000 proverbs of Solomon in the Bible. And I think there may be some of his songs in the Psalms, but certainly not 1,005. And we have almost none of his comments on naturalism. We don't have his the record of his observation about trees and hyssop and wildlife. But he was a preeminent scientist of his day, not just a philosopher. And so there were probably a lot of writings of Solomon that just don't survive to this day. And whether that's because they just weren't useful for God telling his story, or there was bad information in them, I don't really know. Most of them will probably never be found. It would be awesome if we could find some ancient writings of Solomon one day, but I really don't expect to. Now, the book of Proverbs is divided up into multiple sections. And as you read it, you'll see some of these. It will say, these are the Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, or these are the sayings of the wise. These are the further sayings of the wise. So these are natural divisions within the book of Proverbs. The first, Proverbs chapters 1 through 9, is a collection of longer Proverbs of Solomon. Lots of examples of, this is the woman to stay away from. This is the woman that you should be looking for. Here's how you find wisdom. And then in the second book of Proverbs of Solomon is Proverbs chapter 10 through 22:16. A lot of shorter Proverbs, collections of advice. Then the sayings of the wise. We don't know who these wise men were or wise women. It's possible that it were the men that were that were mentioned in Kings. These other men that it said Solomon was wiser than. And we'll get to why I think that's possible here in a little bit. There are two collections of those. The first one starts with, these are the sayings of the wise. And the second one starts with, and these are additional sayings of the wise. Then there's another section written by Solomon, what I called book 3 here. And then finally, at the end, there are two sections written by other people, and we don't really know who they are. Proverbs 30 was written by Agur, son of Yakeh. We have no idea who that person is. And the final chapter, the words of King Lemuel. It's possible that Lemuel is another name for Solomon. If I remember correctly, the name means for God or with God. So that could be just another section written by Solomon. So since most of it was written by Solomon, and much of it that wasn't written by him was probably compiled by him, I think it's useful to talk about who Solomon was, because if you don't know who wrote something, you're really missing a lot of context. You're not going to understand why someone would write what they did unless you know who they were and where they came from. So Solomon was the third king of Israel. He reigned from about 970 to 930 BC. He was not the first son of David. He actually wasn't even born until David was reigning as king, and he had been king for years. David was probably king for at least 10 years before Solomon was born. So he had many older brothers. Solomon grew up in the palace. He was always wealthy, always treated as royalty. He never had the experiences that David did as a shepherd or any kind of hardship really in his life that wasn't self-imposed. He had at least 10 stepmothers because David also had numerous wives and at least 18 siblings. We mostly know about his brothers. So I would be willing to bet that he probably had at least 30 siblings. And he was promoted past most of his older brothers. I don't even know if he had any younger brothers. Probably did, but I don't know of any. Most of his older brothers were of pretty poor character. It's hard to imagine that, King David, the man after God's own heart, would be such a terrible father, but it appears that he was, because most of his children were very poorly behaved, and Solomon among them. The book of Ecclesiastes shows that Solomon really behaved poorly in his youth. He made a lot of bad mistakes. He focused his life on trying to be happy rather than trying to be wise or to accomplish anything useful. And eventually he realized that the pursuit of happiness is really a losing game. You can be happy through doing meaningful tasks, by having a mission, but you can't necessarily be happy by trying to be happy. He was anointed as king before David died, and that was to forestall his older brother, who had declared himself to be king. So in order to make sure that the nation followed Solomon, David declared him king and had him anointed and sat on the throne before David had even died. And that was actually pretty common. This was how you ensure a peaceful transition from one king to another, is to make sure that everybody knows who the new king is before the old king dies. He created a lot of alliances with foreign powers, especially with Egypt. Solomon had a lot of admiration for the culture and the politics of Egypt, and he tried to emulate a lot of what they did in Israel. Some of that was good, some of that was bad. One of the really negative effects of his alliance with foreign powers was all of his pagan wives. It wasn't that he was a sex fiend. He wasn't out just collecting women. He was bringing these women into his household as part of an alliance with, maybe it was, a king of a single city, or a pharaoh, or the king of Syria, probably Edom and Moab and all of these other peoples around Israel, and not just daughters of their kings, but daughters of their nobility also. So he ended up with hundreds of them. He also engaged in a lot of trade. He had close ties with leaders of Tyre and Sidon, The Phoenicians are renowned as being ocean-going traders. They circumnavigated Africa thousands of years before Columbus came to America. They visited the British Isles, and there's some pretty good evidence that the Phoenicians visited Scandinavia and established trade networks all throughout the Mediterranean and the Atlantic coast of Europe and Africa, and even in the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea. As I mentioned earlier, Solomon was a naturalist and a philosopher, and he actively sought out wisdom. Once he realized that his pursuit of happiness was getting him nowhere useful, he changed his tact and he asked God for wisdom because he knew that he was going to be king. And I don't know whether he was ever happy, but he certainly did learn some wisdom and passed it down to us. He took 3 paths to gain his wisdom. His first path, well, these aren't in chronological order. This is the way that they came to my mind. He was an observer of the world. He observed people and he observed nature. You can learn a lot just from watching the world around you. He listened. He listened to sages. He listened to the elders of Israel, to the priests, to the Torah, and he listened to foreign leaders also, foreign sages. And finally, through living. And a lot of this comes through in the book of Ecclesiastes. You can learn a lot of knowledge by observing and by listening, but until you learn to apply it through life, it doesn't really become wisdom, at least not in most cases. Unfortunately, Solomon took the hard route there instead of listening and then living. Okay, so the authorship of the book of Proverbs is really where I think you're going to find some surprises. As I said, much of it was written by King Solomon, the first 22 chapters or most of it. But then there's a section in chapters 22 and 23 that appears to be adapted from an Egyptian wisdom writing. Someone named, I don't know whether this was his real name or just a pseudonym, but Amenempi, I don't know how to pronounce that. You can read it on the screen. This man's writings still survive today, at least a lot of them. There's a scroll, something like 11 feet long, that was discovered that has the writings of Amenempi. But in any case, there are a lot of parallels with the Proverbs, and it even appears that Solomon might have read this work in his day and adapted them to his own sayings. They're not word for word because this Egyptian was not a worshiper of Yahweh, and you have to be careful when you're trying to learn wisdom from somebody who does not fear God. There's a level of fearing God almost everywhere. No matter what religion people have, they have an instinctive fear of God. So there is an amount of wisdom almost everywhere. But you have to be careful because it's always tainted with something. And in this case, Solomon didn't just take the writings of this Egyptian and insert them into the Proverbs. He read them and adapted them to a God-fearing people. So the reason that most scholars believe that Solomon adapted from the Egyptian sage instead of the other way around is that the Egyptian writings appear to date to about 100 to 300 years before the reign of Solomon. Ancient dating is very difficult to pinpoint. There's always a lot of disagreement, and I think that historians are wrong much of the time. I'm not a historian myself, so I'm not a good judge of exactly when they're wrong, but sometimes the dates just don't add up. I suspect that they are right here, but that the writings of Amenempi, that's a really hard name to say. I suspect that they are not the writings of a single person, but just like the Proverbs of Solomon, they were compiled over centuries. And Solomon may have had access to some of those writings, and some of them may have been written after his reign. In any case, there's another section written by Solomon, a section written by anonymous sages. Now, I meant this the names that I mentioned from First Kings, since that one passage mentions the sages of Egypt, and it says Solomon was wiser than all the sages of Egypt and also wiser than these other 3 or 4 guys, since he included some Egyptian wisdom in Proverbs, I suspect that those names were there because he also learned from them. But he was the student who became the master. He exceeded the people that he learned from and then adapted their teaching to something that honored God. Excuse me. And then finally, Agur, son of Yakeh, and King Lemuel. Here's where it means for God. And that could be the same as King Solomon. I think that's what most people believe. So the Book of Proverbs, they were compiled to teach the people of Israel how to live a better life. This is from verses 32 and 33 in chapter 1. The simple are killed by their turning away, and the complacency of fools destroys them. But whoever listens to me, that is wisdom, will dwell secure and will be at ease without dread of disaster. Now, Solomon actually says that he wrote the Proverbs in order to teach people wisdom. But he wants to teach people wisdom because it will help them live a better life. Proverbs is one of the most practical books in the Bible. Between the Torah itself and Proverbs, you could learn to live a very good life. And from living a good life that honors God and that is full of peace, I think happiness really comes from that, and rather than trying to get happiness on its own. The name Proverbs, in Hebrew, it's Mishlei. It literally means Proverbs. One thing that people sometimes get mixed up on is that the Proverbs do not contain commandments. These are not precepts and laws, and they're not promises. They are principles. So when the proverb says, if you do this, you will live a long life. Well, that's a tendency. If you do this, you will tend to live a longer life than if you did something else. So if you apply wisdom to your life, you will have more prosperity, more happiness, better relationships, but better than they would be if you did not apply wisdom. It doesn't guarantee that you will be happy or prosperous or live a long life. Solomon himself did not live a long life. He was king for 40 years, but he became king when he was fairly young. He was probably no more than 20 when he became king. And I think rabbinic tradition puts it at like 12 years old. I don't think that's reasonable from the biblical account, but he was fairly young. So he probably did not live more than to about 60 to 65 years old, which is about the same age as David lived. Even though both of these men had great wisdom, they didn't really live long lives. And partly that's because the life of a king was a hard one in a different way than a laborer. They did have to be warriors. When the nation went to war, the king was expected to be out there in the front lines. We know from the story of David that once you get bogged down in administration, you can't always be there in the battles, but you are expected to show up from time to time just to still prove that you could. Egypt had a tradition where the pharaoh had to go and prove his physical fitness in some public displays every 30 years. So when he became king, he had to go through these trials. And then if he was still king 30 years later, he had to go through these trials again to prove to everybody that he was still fit to lead the troops in war. So following Solomon's advice will tend to help you live longer, but it's far from guaranteed. And this is one of the core principles of Proverbs, and it's right here in chapter 1. The fear of Yahweh is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. Knowledge itself is not wisdom, but knowledge leads to wisdom. You can't have wisdom without some kind of knowledge. It doesn't mean you need to have a lot of book learning. It doesn't mean you need to go to university, but it does mean you need to know stuff. You need to know people. You need to know how the world works. Without that, wisdom is impossible. And you can't know any of that unless you understand who God is. And if you understand who God is, you will fear him. If you don't fear God, then you don't know God. The word for fear here is yirah in Hebrew, and Brown Driver Briggs Hebrew definitions defines it as fear, terror, fearing, respect, reverence, piety. And just through the way that it's used, people will they like to say that this is a reverent awe of God. And I think that's true, but I don't think it really gets to the heart of the matter. This verse in a couple of verses here in Psalm 90:11, who considers the power of your anger and your wrath according to the fear of you? And then in Exodus 20, Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. Don't fear, but fear. Do not fear means don't fear everybody else. Don't fear that God is going to squash you, but God is going to test you. And if you fear him, if you understand who God is, you can pass these tests. And I think this is probably the best definition of the fear of God that I have seen. The fear of Yahweh is an acute and persistent awareness of his power, authority, and holiness. If you know God's power, he created the entire universe by just speaking it. He can destroy you, both body and spirit. He has ultimate authority over life and death and the very existence of everything that is. And he is ultimately holy. He is separate from everything because there is nothing in the universe that can compare to him. And if you really understand that, you will fear God. It's not the fear of, the pagan gods who might smite you for, for any minor infraction or for, offending them in some way that you don't even understand. It's more the fear that you would have of a bonfire or maybe a nuclear plant. You don't play with a nuclear power plant. You take all the precautions that you need to make sure that it's run safely. God has rules about how to approach him in the temple and the altar. And if you do anything wrong, you could die. Aaron's sons, Nadab and Abihu, they knew how to approach God, but they thought, we're just going to put some fire in these pans and, we're going to dance around and worship God. I know he didn't tell us to do it this way, but I think he'll be okay with it. God was not okay with it. He had a very specific way that he wanted his priests to approach him. You do things God's way, or you might be destroyed, not because God wants to destroy you, but because he's dangerous. There is power in God's presence, and you don't treat it casually. I think that's what the fear of Yahweh is about.